You know, there are a lot of things in life that sometimes can be difficult, can be tough. Experiences that we have, circumstances that we're faced with, situations, things of that nature. But one of the things in life that I think sometimes is difficult and catches us off guard because we don't always know how to respond is when we find ourselves in a broken relationship. When we find ourselves at odds with maybe someone in our life or maybe someone from our past, the idea of reconciliation and forgiveness can be a struggle. Such a struggle that sometimes it's just easier to say, you know what, I'm not going to bother. You know, I'll just never speak to that person again. I'll keep my distance from that person and we'll just let things be. Tonight, as we're journeying through the study of Jacob, we've come to the portion of the story where Jacob is going to have to confront his past. If you remember the story, as we've been going through this, Jacob has spent about 20 years away from home. He has been in the land of Haran. He has been living, with his uncle Laban. Where there he fell in love with Laban's daughters daughter, was tricked into marrying not one but two and taking two concubines. And then after 14 years of serving, he served another 6 years or so for the flock that he would take back home with him. And so he's been gone for 20 years. And you remember what led him to leaving in the first place, right? Why did he leave? Yeah, he had to leave because his brother was going to kill him, right? Because when he schemed and deceived and tricked his father and his brother, back in Genesis chapter 27, brother vowed and said, listen, when my father dies, I'm going to kill my brother. And so Rebekah hears that. Rebekah says, hey, you need to leave for just a little while, go to your uncle's house. And when your brother basically gets over it, when the anger passes, I'll call for you. And I imagine, in all honesty, I think Jacob probably thought that call would have already come at this point in his life. I don't think Jacob probably thought it was going to take 21 years before he would find himself back home. I don't think Rebekah thought it would take that long. She thought that Esau would get over it pretty quickly. Apparently, maybe he didn't. At some point, Rebekah has passed away. We don't read anything else about her. And so Jacob has been gone for 21 years until God finally says, hey, it's time for you to go home. It's time for you to go to this land that I've promised you. And you remember as Jacob makes his way back home, we talked a little bit last week, as he's nearing the promised land, he has that vision where he sees the angels, the encampment of God's angels. And then, which is kind of interesting because when he left the land of Canaan, there was the angels ascending and descending from heaven, right? And then now as he's coming back, there's more angels, which signifies that God is with him, right? That he's got this protection, that things are going to be okay. Which at this point in Jacob's life, Jacob needs. Because Jacob is nervous, because Jacob is about to have to face his brother, because he knows in order to get back home, I have to go through the land where my brother is, the land of Seir, the land of Edom, and I'm going to have to face that past. I'm going to have to face my mistake. And what's interesting is, as Jacob is preparing for his encounter with his brother, he has to first have an encounter with God. You know, Jacob is making these plans, and that's, we kind of jumped forward a little bit last week, and we talked about that encounter that Jacob has where he wrestles with that man that he seems to think is divine in some way. And so what I want to do tonight is kind of back up a little bit in Genesis chapter 32 and look at the beginning of that chapter. And then we're going to get into chapter 3, and we're going to see this reunion that takes place between Jacob and Esau. And in this reunion, I think we're going to, learn at least 4 very important lessons about reconciliation that we can use in our own lives. So Genesis chapter 32 is where we're going to start. As Jacob is making his way back home, he's had this vision. And you remember after he has this vision of the angels, we talked a little bit about this last week. He sends messengers to Esau, right? To tell him, hey, I'm coming back. I've been with Laban for, this entire time I've been gone. And this is me passing back. And I have all these oxen, these animals, and these servants. And I just want you to know kind of what I'm doing. I want to have favor in your sight. I'm not coming back to start trouble. I'm not coming back to start a fight, right? That's not my intention. And so he sends these messengers in verse 6. And apparently they find Esau pretty quickly, and they come back home, and look what it says. It says, we came to your brother Esau. He is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. So we talked about why Jacob would be scared, right? Because I don't think, this is probably a welcoming party on Jacob's behalf, right? This is men that Esau have with him. Some people think that he's off fighting against his enemies when the messengers of Jacob show up. That's why he has these 400 men. But Jacob gets word that these 400 men are with him and that he's coming to meet him. And the Bible says Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Well, that makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense for him to feel this way because in his mind, my brother's going to kill me. My brother's going to seek his revenge. And so as we think about this idea of reconciliation, as we go through this, the first thing I want you to understand about reconciliation is that reconciliation can be difficult. It's not easy. Look what happens. Starting in verse 7. Jacob divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 camps, thinking, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. So Jacob learns that Esau's coming, and what's the first thing Jacob does? All right, he splits his camp, right? He divides his camp. If my brother's going to attack me, if he attacks one part of the camp, well, at least maybe the other one will make it free, right? He's trying to think, how can I at least have something left when this encounter with my brother is over? So the first thing he does is he divides his family. But then notice the second thing, verse 9. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who has said to me. Now that phrase is going to be important. The God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac. Remember, he's never finished that statement up until this point. Return, O Lord, the God of my father, the God of Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, this is a prayer now, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. So the first thing he says as he prays is he reminds God, hey, God, you're the one that told me to come back. You're the one that has told me I need to go home, and my brother's here and he's coming out to meet me. So God, you have a little bit of a responsibility here. He goes on to say, but I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds and the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. So one, God, I want to remind you that I'm coming back here because you're the one that told me to come back here. But number 2, hey, God, you've been gracious to me. You've been good to me. I left with nothing but a staff in my hand. And I'm coming back and I've got 2 encampments, right? I've got this huge family. I've got all these animals, right? God, you're the one who has blessed me. Verse 11. God, please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me and the mothers with the children. So, God, you told me to come back. God, you've been really good to me. And God, here's my request. Protect me. Protect my family. Protect the mother of my children. Because, again, in his mind, Esau is going to attack. And then he goes on to say, but you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for the multitude. So he ends his prayer kind of reminding God, hey, God, remember the promise you made. Remember the promise 21 years ago that you made when I was there in Bethel, right? So Jacob has prayed this prayer, right? Now look what happens, verse 13. So he stayed there that night. From what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau. 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels, their calves, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. And these he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. And he instructed the first, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed in the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him. And you shall say, moreover, that your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face, and perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. So as Jacob learns what is happening, that Esau is coming out to meet him, the first thing he does is what? Okay, divides the camp, right? We divide the camp. Second thing he does is, right, he prays. And the third thing he does is he... That Brother Jones's fault. And the third thing he does is what? He sends presents. Now why is he sending presents? To soften him up? Oh, hold on, we got to get the mic. Got to have the mic. It's important for YouTube apparently, so let's just get on the mic. Get on the mic. Go ahead, Philip Heffington.
Well, functionally speaking...
Hold the mic closer to you.
Functionally speaking, getting the birthright really didn't accomplish anything. He had to move away. Mm-hmm. He had to start from scratch. And so, whatever Esau thought he lost out on, okay, the reality is, except for the prestige of that, and in particular, the promise of God, but I don't think Esau or Jacob was really worried about that at the time. But
right.
Just functionally speaking, what he's going to give him was a whole lot more than he got as part of the birthright. A ton more. Yeah. He didn't get a single animal or anything. He had to go and work for 20 years to get 2 wives.
and 2 concubines.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, you know, it's interesting because here's what Jacob is doing what all husbands who find themselves in hot water do, right? He's trying to buy forgiveness, right? Like, I messed up 21 years ago in how I treated you and what I did to you, so let me right that wrong by giving you some presents, right? We would give flowers or chocolate or take them to dinner or something of that nature. Jacob realizes how much he's messed up, and Jacob says, I'm going to send all these animals. And it's interesting because the estimated, like scholars estimate, like how much all that would have cost in that day and time. And many scholars believe that the entourage that he sends, 550 animals, plus you got the ones that had the calves, you know, maybe up to 580 different animals, would have probably cost about $100,000. Now, that may not sound like a lot in our day and time. Personally, I think $100,000 is quite a bit in our day and time. But it was a whole lot of money in that day and time, right? And he sent them, and notice how he's not sending them all at one time, right? He's sending them in droves. What's the purpose of sending them in droves? Right. So, do it. Okay, if he kills that group, maybe. If he rejects him, he can take the others back. Okay, maybe if he rejects it, he can pull the animals back.
Each time it's a gift.
Each time's a gift, yeah. I think what he's doing is he's trying to get Esau's attention. Like, you know, he sends, you know, just imagine he sends 100 of these animals at one time. Hey, here's a gift for you. A few hours later, here comes 100 more. Here's a gift for you, right? And it just continues to come, and there's this idea, if you're Esau, like, whoa, my brother is really going above and beyond, right? You know, I think about like when grandparents with grandchildren, you know, like my boys love when the grandparents come, specifically Miranda's parents, because when Mimi comes, Mimi brings presents. And Mimi brings droves of presents. You know, they just like keep coming, you know, and it's like, stop spoiling the boys. You know, they're going to expect gifts all the time, you know, but that's kind of what Jacob's doing here, right? He's trying to appease his brother because he understands, you know what? Reconciliation is difficult. He may not forgive me. Remember the last time 21 years ago, he said, I'm going to kill this guy. And now he's coming at me and he's got 400 men. And in Jacob's mind, that's exactly what he's coming to do. So Jacob's trying to soften things up.
I just had a question.
The mic's only for comments.
So, well, that's what I tried to tell him. But
go ahead.
So in my head, I'm just curious as to Jacob's going to give him all these animals, but yet they said, he's coming with 400 men. So if I were Jacob, I'd be thinking, does he really need all my animals? If he has 400 men, what else does he have that I don't know of? Like, do we know anything about what Esau had versus Jacob at that point?
Esau has plenty, and Esau is going to say that when Jacob comes to him and he's like, "What's the deal with the gifts? I don't need your gifts. I have enough." I think what Jacob's doing is Jacob is just trying to show him that his intentions are not evil, right? Like, I am coming back. I am trying to make right a wrong from 21 years ago. I'm trying to restore this relationship, and I hope you see that by this lavish gift that I'm giving you and all these animals, whether you need it or not. It's kind of like those people. What do you give somebody that has everything? I don't know, but at Christmas we got to get them something, right? So you figure something out, right? And I think that's kind of what Jacob's doing. This is what Jacob owns, right? Jacob left with nothing. Now Jacob has been blessed. And part of it, he could be trying to show his brother what he has, if you want to think that about Jacob. But I really think it's Jacob trying to make right with his brother, right? And so you're going to get to the end of chapter 32, which we talked about last week, the wrestling match. And so we're going to move on to chapter 33, because again, at that point, it's interesting because at this point, Jacob knows that Esau's coming. He knows Esau has these 400 men. He knows that, in his mind, he thinks, okay, he wants to kill me, right? That's what my brother wants to do to me. So he prays to God. He reminds God, hey, I'm only in this situation because you told me to come back home. And, oh, by the way, I really need you to protect me here. Kind of at this point, even still, after having that vision with the angels, still kind of showing a little bit of a lack of faith here, right? And I think that's maybe why Jacob has to have that encounter at the end of chapter 32, because Jacob has to realize at that point, he has to rely solely on God, right? That what's about to happen with Esau has nothing to do with Jacob, and it has nothing to do with gifts that Jacob could give. It has everything to do with God and God protecting Jacob and making provisions for Jacob, right? So you get to chapter 33. And look what it says. It says, "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, and Leah with her children, and then Rachel and Joseph last of all." So as Jacob after he has this encounter with the angel, right, here comes Esau. He sees Esau coming, and he takes his family and divides them up, putting the concubines, so to speak, up front with their children, then Leah, and then Rachel. What's he doing? Okay, our obvious thought is he's showing some favoritism. Now, some people will want to soften this with Jacob and say, well, he's really just kind of lining them up because this is how he wants to present them to Esau. Well, okay, maybe, but we do know that Jacob struggles with favoritism later on, right, with Joseph. So I think really that's what's going on here. But there is a slight change in his attitude, because you look at verse 3. And verse 3 says, "He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother." So yes, he divides them based on his love, the way he feels about them. But before he lets even the concubines and those children go, Jacob goes first. If you're going to kill anybody, you're going to start with me. And I think that shows a little bit of change in the character of Jacob at this point. That Jacob, especially after this wrestling match that he has, that things are starting to change for Jacob, right? You start to see this change of heart, right? And so when you think about reconciliation, number one, reconciliation is difficult. But the second thing I want you to see is that when it comes to reconciliation, it requires humility. And it requires humility on both the part of the victim, the one who's been hurt, but it also requires humility on the part of the one who's done the offending, right? The one who has caused the heartache and the pain. Because I want you to notice Jacob's response. Jacob goes up to Esau, he's at the front, and he bows himself to the ground 7 times. Right? Which is kind of the way you would, in that day and time, that you would treat a king, that you would prostrate yourself 7 times before a king. And Jacob does that to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes, he saw the women and the children, and he said, "Who were these with you?" Now that's an interesting question. Right? Like, who are all these people with you? And Jacob begins to explain, well, these are the children whom God has graciously given to your servant. And then the servants drew near, and they and their children bowed down. Leah, likewise, her children. And then last, Joseph and Rachel draw near, and they bow down. It's interesting because I don't know if this kind of lets us understand a little bit about the culture of that day, but as Esau sees these 4 women, and he sees all these children, and Jacob is trying to explain, well, this is my wife, and well, this is her maidservant, and well, I had children with her and her maidservant, and here's my other wife, and here's her maidservant. It's almost as if Esau is looking at this saying, what is this? Like, what has happened in your life the last 21 years, bro? Like, you're supposed to leave getting 1 wife, and now you got like 4 and all these kids. And Jacob, notice not just Jacob, but the wives and all the children, they all bow down before Esau. Why are they bowing down? They're following the lead of Jacob. Absolutely. What'd you say, Philip? Yeah, it's a sign of respect, right? Again, Jacob is trying to appease, make appeasement with Esau. He's trying to right a wrong in his life. And in order to do that, you know what Jacob has to do? He has to humble himself. Jacob, the one who God said, hey, you're going to be the one who's blessed, right? The older is going to serve the younger, but at this moment, Jacob is prostrate on the ground, bowing 7 times. All of his family is doing the same thing. He's offering all these gifts to Esau. Why? Because he's trying to show humility. Esau wants you to know I messed up. You think about it. Was Jacob going to get the blessing? Was Jacob the one to be blessed? Absolutely. God prophesied that from the beginning. But Jacob ran ahead of God, didn't wait on God's timing, and fractured and basically destroyed his family. And oh, how things could have been different if he had a little faith and trust and just waited on God's timing. But he didn't. And he's messed things up. Oh, yeah, Mama, yeah, she's to blame too. Absolutely. And now he's trying to make to basically rectify this wrong with Esau. And in order to do that, I have to humble myself. And that's the way reconciliation works, right? I mean, when you're the person who's the offender, right? When I wrong someone, like there comes a point in time I have to humble myself and realize, you know what, I've wronged those people. In Colossians chapter 3, when Paul writes about the new man, he talks about clothing yourself with these attributes. And he begins with compassionate hearts, and then kindness. And the third thing he says is humility. You have to be a humble person. And when it comes to relationships, we have to have humility. I have to understand that when I hurt someone, I can be humble enough to say, you know what? I was wrong. I messed up in how I treated you. I've messed up in the way that I talked to you or spoke to you or whatever it might be. And for Jacob, he has to humble himself. And that's what you see here. Jacob is humbling himself, but you don't just see Jacob humbling himself. You also see Esau humbling himself. Because as Jacob comes out and Jacob's bowing on the ground, what's verse 4 tell you about Esau? He ran to him and he did what? He hugged him, and he kissed him, and they embraced, and they cried. Now, what does that remind you of? The story of the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15, verse 20, when the father sees the son, who had been the one in the wrong, and the father embraces and weeps with him and kisses him and clothes him, right? You begin to see this attitude change, not just with Jacob, but you see this attitude change with even Esau. In the way that Esau is humbling himself, right? The way that Esau is responding to Jacob. When people hurt us, when people wrong us, right? And sometimes it fractures relationships. When you're the victim of whatever it was that happened, it can be hard sometimes to get over that. It really can. It can be hard to choose the high road, as we might say, and choose to do what the Bible teaches, which is to forgive. I mean, you remember Jesus was asked the question in Matthew, the 18th chapter. Peter comes to him, verse 20, and Peter says, Lord, if my brother sins against me, How many times do I have to forgive him? Up to 7 times. Now listen, if you wrong me 7 times, that's a whole lot in my book, right? And like 1 time, okay, 2 times, 3 times, 7 times, that's just a little ridiculous. And so Peter probably feels good about himself saying, Lord, if I forgive him 7 times, 7 kind of the number for completeness or wholeness. And Jesus looks at him and says, no, Peter, not 7 times. What's Jesus say? Yeah. Some translations say 77 times. Some say 7 times 7. How you translate the Greek word there is not what's important, because it's not about the number, right? It's about the attitude. That if your brother sins against you and it's in your power to forgive, you know what you're to do? You're to forgive. That's the point that Jesus is making, right? The Bible teaches clearly that God expects his people to have an attitude of reconciliation, right? Earlier, before you get to the part there and where Peter asked that question and Jesus tells the parable about the unforgiving servant, you have Jesus saying, hey, if your brother sins against you, what are you to do? You're to go to him, and you're to tell him, you're to talk to him. And if he listens, he says, you've gained your brother, right? You've won him back. You've reconciled the relationship. That's how Christians are supposed to operate, right? We're supposed to be humble enough to say, you know what? If I'm the one who's wronged you, I'm big enough to admit I messed up and I need forgiveness. And if you've wronged me and I'm the victim, I need to be big enough and humble enough to, you know what? I forgive you. Right? I'm not going to choose to seek revenge. I'm not going to choose to hold this grudge. I'm going to choose to humble myself and allow you to be forgiven, right? To grant you that. All right, Philip, hold on. Mike's coming. Go ahead.
There's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think reconciliation requires forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But forgiveness can be entirely one-sided. Reconciliation requires both sides.
Both parties.
Somewhere in all this, it seems to me that whatever bad blood there was, because there were a whole lot of people blamed for how it was played out. But time and or just, reminiscing, missing your brother, whatever. Somewhere in there, Esau forgave, which allowed for
The reconciliation took place, right?
And our responsibility is not for reconciliation per se, because that may or may not.
Right.
But to forgive.
To have that forgiving attitude. Absolutely, yeah. And I think, too, here what we see with Esau, I don't think this is just Esau. I think this is God working in the heart of Esau to soften that heart. Because, again, what was the promise he made to Jacob? I'm going to protect you, right? And Esau was his vow, I'm going to kill him, right? I don't know where Matt went. Oh, I guess we lost the mic. Philip broke it. Piggyback.
And conform to the transform instead of conform.
Right.
So when years pass and they're both older, he's also his fault.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's not necessarily just what they did to me.
Yeah, he grew too. Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of the idea of, reconciliation. It takes 2 parties to reconcile. But again, Jacob did his part to try to make the reconciliation happen, not knowing how Esau was going to respond. Like in his mind, I'm going to send him all these gifts, but he may kill all these animals and still come kill me and my family. I don't know what he's going to do. Jacob was just hopeful that the relationship could be restored. And I think as Christians, that's kind of where we find ourselves. Like, I can't control whether or not you want to reconcile the relationship if there's something that happened between us. But I can forgive you or maybe ask you to forgive me if I've wronged you. I can't control how you respond. Hopefully you respond the way Esau responded, right? And things work out. But that's not always the case. So notice what happens. Verse 8. So Esau said, what do you mean by all this company that I met? Jacob answered, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. And Jacob said, no, please, if I found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, the change that has taken place. And you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing. Same word. It's used back in Genesis 27 to talk about what Jacob has stolen from Esau. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. Thus he urged him and he took it. So what's happening here? As Esau sees all this whole company of things and the gifts, he asks the question, what's the deal with the gifts? And Jacob says, well, the gifts are for you, right? I mean, I want you to have these. And Esau's response is, I have enough. And in the Hebrew, it literally means I have enough. Like I don't need any gifts, right? I don't want to take those gifts. But Jacob keeps insisting, no, you need to take the gifts, right? I need you to take the gifts. And the reason Jacob wants him to take the gifts could be a couple things. Obviously, he's trying to rectify this relationship. But the receiving of gifts, the exchanging of gifts was a sign of appeasement. It was a sign of peace. And so if Esau accepted the gifts, then Esau was basically saying, hey, we're going to have peace. But if Esau rejects these gifts, then it's Esau saying, there's always going to be strife between us. Like we're not reconciling. We're not fixing things. And so that's why Jacob is pushing him when Esau says, I have enough. But notice Jacob says the same thing in the English translation, right? No, you take the gift, I have enough. But really, in the Hebrew, the way it's translated is, Esau says, I have enough. And when Jacob responds and says, no, you take these gifts because I have, he says, everything. I have what I need. Perhaps going back to what has just happened in his life, right? And the blessing that God has made and the wrestling with God. This leads to the third thing about reconciliation. Reconciliation requires people to be willing to change. And I think in both of these individuals, you see change take place, right? You see Jacob change and Jacob wanting to make things right and admit that he's wrong and the willingness to give this gift. But you also see the change in Esau. Because Esau vowed to kill him, and now Esau's kissing him, right? Jacob wants to give him gifts, and instead of saying, yeah, you owe me, buddy, I'll take all your stuff. Esau says, no, I don't need your gifts. And then Esau eventually does agree to take the gifts because Jacob keeps persisting. And then look what happens. It's interesting. Esau says, let us be on our journey. On our way, I will go ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail and that they are the nursing flocks and herds are care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. So let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir, or until I come to him in Edom. So not only does Esau not kill him, not only is he'd say, hey, I don't really want your gifts. I mean, not that he didn't want to make peace, but I don't need your gifts. But the third thing you see is Esau basically says, hey, let's go back together. Let me help protect you, right? I got all these men, right? Let us go back together and I will protect you. And Jacob says, no, you go on ahead, right? I've got the children and we got the animals. They're going to go at a slower pace. And we can make talk a lot about why does Jacob respond this way? Why doesn't he want Esau to go back with him? Some people, think it's because Jacob, doesn't want to be around Esau. But the point is, Esau's offering to protect him. And Jacob says, that's okay. You don't have to do that, right? In fact, you look at verse 15. So Esau's response then is, well, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. Right? So, okay, I won't stay, but let me at least leave some of the men with me, this army basically that I have, and let them travel back with you. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So what I want you to think about when it comes to reconciliation is, in order for reconciliation to take place, you have to have people that are willing to change, right? Not only do they have to humble themselves enough to admit they're wrong or to be willing to forgive, but they also have to be willing to make changes in their life. Because if there was an issue before, you may forgive me or I may forgive you, but if the issue doesn't change, guess what's going to happen? We're still going to have some problems. We're still going to have issues. And so you see both of these men, you see their hearts softening. And again, remember, Esau is described in the New Testament as a very profane man. Right now, he's not a very holy man. But God has at least worked in his heart enough that he sees his brother differently. Right? He wants to treat his brother differently. Right? So, see how the story ends.
But we don't know if Esau was changed.
Yeah, at this point, yeah. But he's described in the New Testament as profane. But look how it ends. Verse 16. We got like just a few minutes. She said no to that mic, man. So get that out of my face. Verse 16. So Esau returned that day on the way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth. Succoth just means booth, right? Or booths. And he built himself a house, and he made booths for his livestock. And therefore the name of the place was called Succoth. Now this is what's interesting. If you go back to before I do that, let me say this about reconciliation. Right? Reconciliation can be difficult. Reconciliation requires humility for both individuals or all individuals. It requires people to change. And the fourth thing is it can lead to peace. When you do reconcile those relationships, it can lead to peace. And what's interesting is you don't read about a brotherly feud, right? In fact, you're not going to read really much about Esau from this point forward. You're going to read in chapter 36 about his descendants, but you're not going to read a whole lot about Esau, right? The story is now going to focus on Jacob and Jacob's children and Jacob's family and the many problems they face. But here's what's interesting. First, the end of verse 14, right? So Jacob says, "You let my Lord pass on ahead with his servants. I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock ahead of me, at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So it's almost as if Jacob's promising to go be where Esau, I'm going to come to you. But the end of the chapter, where does Jacob go? Well, before he goes into the land of promise, he ends up in the land of Succoth, right? Jacob's here. And Esau's over here. And people see that and people say, "Oh, Jacob's being Jacob again." Right? Jacob's being that trickster. Right? He's a deceiver. Right? He's trying to get away from his brother. Tells his brother, "You go on ahead of me. I'm going to come to you." And as soon as his brother gets out of sight, man, Jacob changes directions and he goes the opposite direction. "I'm not going to be around my brother." And so there are people that read that and they read that about Jacob. And they think, it's just Jacob being Jacob. He's a deceiver, right? He's a hill grabber. He's a trickster, right? That's who he is. He hasn't changed. But here's what I want you to think about. The words that Jacob says don't imply that Jacob is going to go and dwell in the land where Esau is. He just says, "I'm going to come to you," right? We might say it this way: "I'm going to come visit you," right? Like, I go visit people, I don't go live where they are. I got my parents, I'll drive and see them, but I come back to my home, right? To my dwelling place. And when I think about Jacob, people want to jump on Jacob real quick and say, "Well, it's just the same old Jacob." But I don't know that he is. Because ultimately, where's Jacob supposed to be? He's supposed to be in the land of Canaan. Now he's going to make a pit stop here and spend some time before he gets there. But eventually he's going to find himself where God called him to be, right? And so as we read that, and you may not even thought about that or notice that, but I just want you to think about the fact that, number one, I don't think that's Jacob saying that he's going to go live where Esau lives. But the second thing is, I would say this: the Bible doesn't tell us that Jacob never went. Just because there's no mention of it doesn't mean that Jacob lied. Doesn't mean that Jacob was being deceitful to his brother. In fact, we do know that Jacob and Esau saw each other again. Because at the end of Genesis chapter 35, you have the death of Isaac. And as the story of Isaac ends, and Isaac hasn't been talked about in several chapters, and he's just briefly mentioned at the end of chapter 35, and it talks about his death, and it ends this way. Isaac was buried by his sons, Jacob and Esau. In other words, they did spend some time together. So I point that out because, if you read or study, if you notice that, you may think, well, Jacob's just being Jacob. That deceiver, that trickster. But I don't think that was the case. Now, maybe he didn't go down, but maybe he had a good reason for not going. Maybe he didn't want to be around Esau because of how Esau's described. Well, we don't know. But we have to be careful to just immediately draw conclusions and think, well, it's the same old Jacob. Because I believe you start to see the heart of Jacob change with that experience that he had at the end of Genesis chapter 32. Right? He's not going to be a perfect man. He's going to make lots of mistakes. But that limp that he was given on that occasion, I think remained, not the limp itself physically perhaps, maybe it did, but I think that the impact of that remained with him for the rest of his life. So, any closing thoughts or comments as we end tonight? All right. Well, thank you for your comments. Thank you, Matt, for running the mic around. And see you guys next week.